Medieval peasants didn't have comfort, convenience, or second chances. What they did have were survival skills. Quiet, clever, and sometimes strange. These weren't taught in books, they were learned by doing, failing, and trying again. These 7 skills kept people alive day after day, year after year. And it all started with knowing how to find food when there was none at home. In the medieval world, foraging wasn't some weekend hobby. It was hardcore survival. Everyday peasants roamed fields and forests, hunting for anything edible to keep starvation at bay. The average medieval peasant spent 3 hours daily foraging during growing seasons. Their mushroom spotting skills were so good, they could find fungi in places Google Maps would miss. Archaeobotanical studies from 13th century England show peasants gathered over 50 types of wild plants, with evidence of dandelion and nettle remains in village waste pits. These weren't pleasant nature walks. They were desperate food hunts where empty hands meant empty stomachs. Wild greens were foraging gold. Dandelions, which we now poison with weed killer, were medieval superfoods. Peasants used every part: leaves for eating, flowers for drink, and roots for medicine. Manorial records from 1290 list dandelion wine as a taxable good, showing its widespread use. If medieval peasants saw our perfectly manicured lawns, they'd think we'd lost our minds, throwing away perfectly good salad. Berries were medieval candy bars in a world without chocolate. During peak season, skilled foragers could gather enough to last through winter. Some villages actually accepted preserved berries as tax payments when coins ran short. The original berry complicated tax system brought rolls from 14th century Norfolk document berry payments in lieu of coin, valued at half a day's wage per bushel. Mushroom hunting was literally life or death. One wrong pick, and your family might be planning your funeral. Medieval mushroom identification was basically extreme sports before they learned to read, with grandma serving as the final quality control inspector. The original Food Safety Administration, just with more wrinkles and fewer clipboards. Herbal texts from 12th century monasteries note over 20 edible fungi species, with warnings about toxic lookalikes. Acorns seem like squirrel food today, but they saved countless peasant lives during famines. The bitter nuts required days of soaking to become edible. During squirrel snacks into human survival, Scavations at Warham Percy reveal acorn processing pits, with charred remains indicating large gathering operations during the 1315 famine. Strict laws about foraging locations added extra danger. Most forests belonged to nobles or the church, and trespassing carried harsh penalties. Records from 1267 show. Imagine getting beaten up just for picking some mushrooms. Medieval lords were basically the original get-off-my-lawn guys, except with dungeons instead of garden hoses. Assize rolls from 1267 Yorkshire confirm fines for unauthorized foraging, equivalent to 14 days' labor. Peasants developed secret signals to warn each other about approaching guards. Specific bird calls or arranged sticks marked paths as dangerous. They passed down mental maps of safe gathering spots through generations, creating an underground foraging network long before social media made sharing locations cool. Manuscripts from 14th century East Anglia describe coded whistles used by foragers to evade forest wardens. Foraging followed nature's calendar religiously. Spring meant wild garlic and tender greens. Summer brought berries and early mushrooms. Fall offered nuts and roots. Winter was survival mode, pine needles, bark, and whatever had been preserved from better times. This deep knowledge of wild foods wasn't just helpful. It was life insurance when crops failed. Of course, foraging was only one piece of the medieval survival puzzle. Medieval farming wasn't just hard work. It was a constant battle against hunger that required serious skill. For peasants, farming wasn't a choice. It was what kept death at a respectful distance. The three-field system ruled medieval farming life. One field grew wheat or rye for bread, another grew peas or barley, and the third sat empty to recover nutrients. Each year they rotated which field did what job. This simple system boosted food production by a third. Medieval farmers invented crop rotation long before anyone invented rotating tires. Agricultural treatises from 13th century England like Walter of Henley's husbandry, advocate three-field rotation for sustained yields. Timing meant everything. Plant too early and frost kills your seeds. Plant too late and drought withers your crop. A single missed week could slash harvest yields by 20%. The medieval farming calendar from the 1300s lists 36 specific planting dates based on saints' days and moon phases, showing just how precise peasants tried to be with their timing. The Capitulary de Villis from the 9th century details planting schedules tied to lunar cycles, adopted across Europe. The tools were shockingly basic. Wooden plows with metal tips scratched shallow furrows in the soil. Oxen pulled these plows at a crawl. These oxen moved with the speed of an elderly turtle with arthritis. But complaining wouldn't get your field plowed any faster. The plow itself was so valuable that some villages shared a single plow between 4 or 5 families, creating detailed sharing schedules that generated plenty of argument. Manorial records from 1280 Suffolk show plow-sharing disputes settled by village elders. Seeds were precious beyond gold. Each spring, farmers carefully measured seed grain, knowing every handful planted meant less bread until harvest. Medieval farms expected about 4 times return on planted seeds. Modern farms get 20 times as much. Bad seed could mean starvation, so testing was serious business. Peasants would pre-sprout small amounts before committing to plant an entire field. The Taquinum Sanitatis advises sprouting seeds in damp cloth to test viability. Manure was farming gold. Peasants collected every scrap of animal waste, human waste, and food scrap. Medieval farms produced about 2 tons of manure per acre annually, roughly a fifth of what modern fields need. Some villages had strict rules about who had rights to collect manure from roadways, with prime spots near taverns being particularly valuable. Court rolls from 14th century Kent document fines for stealing roadside manure, valued at a day's wage per cartload. Family size directly connected to farm size. Each adult could work about 3 acres effectively. This explains why medieval families wanted lots of children, not for love, but as tiny farmhands. Records from one English village show that families with more children consistently had better harvests, not because they were luckier, but because they had more workers. A 1320 survey from Gloucestershire shows larger families yielding 15% more grain per acre. Weather watching became an obsession. Without forecasts, farmers relied on generations of weather wisdom. A ring around the moon meant rain coming. Red sunset meant fair weather tomorrow. Some of these folk methods actually work, backed by science we've only recently understood. A 2020 study in weather confirms red sunsets predict high-pressure systems, aligning with medieval lore. During harvest, everyone worked from dawn until dark. Using hand sickles, a skilled harvester could cut about a quarter acre of grain per day. The original CrossFit challenge was just called harvest season. And instead of a trophy, your prize was not starving to death. Even small children worked, gathering straws that fell during cutting. Not a single edible grain could be wasted. Chronicles from 13th century Oxfordshire describe children as young as 5 collecting stray grains during harvests. Crop failures struck most regions at least once every 25 years. During these times, grain prices could jump 10 times normal within weeks. Records from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 show people paying a month's wages for what would normally be a week's worth of bread. Some villages lost a third of their population during severe multi-year failures. Exchequer rolls from 1316 confirm bread prices rose 800% in some regions. The farmer's constant companion, back pain. The average height of medieval peasants was about 5 feet 4 inches, partly from malnutrition and partly from spines compressed by decades of bending over fields. Skeletal remains from medieval cemeteries show distinctive wear patterns on vertebrae and joints that forensic experts can identify as farmer spine. A 2019 Journal of Archaeological Science study identified spinal lesions in 60% of peasant skeletons. While farming kept peasants fed during harvest seasons, the real challenge came after the crops were in. Growing food was only half the battle for medieval peasants. The other half, making sure that precious food didn't rot before winter ended. Without refrigerators, peasants developed preservation methods that were clever, effective, and sometimes strange. Root cellars formed the cornerstone of medieval food storage. These underground rooms stayed naturally cool year-round. A typical peasant family's root cellar might hold up to 600 pennies of vegetables, enough to provide daily nutrition through the lean months. Excavations at Warham Percy reveal cellars storing 500 pennies of turnips and carrots, sealed with clay lids. Pickling became an art form. Medieval peasants pickled everything: cabbage, turnips, eggs, and even meat when they had it. These pickled foods would make your face pucker up like you just told the lord of the manor his new taxes seemed a bit steep. Manorial inventories from 1290 list 50 barrels of pickled cabbage per village, enough for 6 months. Salt was precious beyond measure. A pound of salt could cost a peasant 3 days' wages, but without it, meat would rot within days. To maximize their salt supplies, medieval households would use the same salt over and over, drying it out between uses. A 14th century household guide recommends reusing salt up to 3 times for meat curing. Smoking meat and fish extended their shelf life from days to months. Medieval smoked ham tasted less like breakfast and more like licking a chimney. But at least you wouldn't die from hunger in January. Archaeological finds from 13th century York show smokehouses processing 200 peels of fish annually. Meat was rare, so when they had it, it got preserved intensely. A pig slaughtered in November would be divided into many parts. Hams were salt-cured and smoked. Bacon was heavily salted. Nothing went to waste: ears, feet, tail, all preserved through various methods. The Liber Aurelium Commodorum details pig preservation. With every organ salted or smoked, dairy presented special challenges. Fresh milk spoiled within hours on warm days. Medieval peasants rarely drank fresh milk. Instead, they immediately process it into more stable forms like butter and cheese. Monastic records from 1300 show 80% of milk converted to cheese within hours of collect. Bread was dried to extend its life. Medieval bread went from fresh to bird-killing weapon in about 3 days flat. When needed, these rock-hard loaves would be softened in broth or beer. A 13th century baking manual advises drying bread on racks to prevent mold. Fruits couldn't be stored fresh for long. Instead, they were dried in the sun, made into jams with honey, or fermented into alcoholic beverages like cider. Village accounts from 14th century Devon list 200 gallons of cider stored per household. These food preservation skills were literally life or death knowledge. Families who preserved food effectively survived winter. Those who didn't might not see spring. But keeping food from spoiling was just one survival skill in a peasant's toolkit. Sometimes you had to be your own handyman too. When something breaks today, we buy a new one. Medieval peasants, they fixed it or lived without it. DIY wasn't a hobby, it was survival. Shoes were precious. When they tore, peasants stitched them with thread made from pig intestines. Craft manuals from 14th century Flanders describe pig gut thread as stronger than flax for shoe repairs. Metal tools were worth their weight in, well, metal. Wooden handles were replaced over and over. A plow blade might outlast 15 handles, the medieval version of changing your phone case while keeping the same cracked screen for years. Blacksmith records from 1300 show plow blades reused for decades with new handles. Pottery repairs bordered on art. Cracked pots were fixed with mixtures of clay and egg whites, then refired. Some medieval pots had so many repairs they looked like they'd been through medieval pottery rehab 5 times. Archaeological finds from 13th century London show pots with multiple clay patches, fired repeatedly. Rope making was a daily skill. A good rope maker could twist 15 feet of 2-strand rope in a day, all without YouTube tutorials or a single like and subscribe. A 14th century trades and crafts manuscript details rope making with hemp, producing 20 feet daily. Candle making kept the darkness away, barely. Tallow candles made from animal fat provided light but smelled terrible. Some medieval writings joke about how the darkness might be preferable to the stink. The original would you rather game with no good options. Monastic accounts from 1320 list 500 tallow candles per year, with complaints about their odor. Medieval soap would make modern germaphobes faint. Made from fat and wood ash lye, it was so caustic one recipe says to boil it until it eats the feather. Your skin didn't stand a chance either. Medieval bathing was less about getting clean and more about surviving the soap. The 13th century recipe in Liber Diversis Medicinus warns against overuse of lye soap due to skin burns. Clothing was repaired until it resembled a patchwork quilt. Most peasants owned just 2 sets, everyday rags and slightly less shabby church clothes. The medieval fashion industry consisted entirely of saying, "That hole makes you look distinguished with a straight face." Textile fragments from 14th century York show garments patched up to 10 times. Tool sharing was common. Most households owned fewer than 15 tools total. Village tool libraries worked on the honor system to return it broken, and everyone knew exactly whose fields would mysteriously catch fire next week. Court records from 1310, Essex note fines for failing to return shared sickles. These DIY skills kept medieval life moving. But sometimes even the handiest peasant needed another skill. Medieval peasants didn't just worry about bad harvests or cold winter, they also faced human threats. Bandits, roaming soldiers, tax collectors, and even neighboring villagers all posed dangers to the few possessions peasants had managed to gather. Villagers created early warning systems that worked surprisingly well. Lookouts posted on high points watched for dust clouds from approaching horsemen or troops. Church bells rang specific patterns to indicate different threats. Villagers became so tuned to these bell patterns that mothers could tell toddlers that your father ran off with a milkmaid bell and get a good laugh. Chronicles from 13th century Lincolnshire describe bell codes signaling bandit raids, with 3 rings for immediate danger. Smoke signals served as another warning method between communities. Simple signals, 1 fire for minor threat, multiple fires for major danger, could be seen for miles. Some villages created systems where the number of smoke columns indicated which direction danger approached from. A 14th century military manual mentions smoke signals coordinating village defenses. Hiding spots for valuables were pre-planned and carefully concealed. Peasants dug small pits beneath hearthstones or under sleeping areas. False walls inside chimneys concealed small treasures. Home security systems back then didn't have monthly fees, just the occasional splinter from digging up floorboards. Archaeological digs in 14th century Devon uncover hearths with hidden caches of coins. Communities developed coordinated responses to threats. Historical records show villages designating specific houses as gathering points during attacks. Some villages even created codes for determining which threats required fighting and which called for hiding. Manorial rolls from 1320. Kent lists designated safe houses for bandit raids. Most medieval peasants couldn't afford real weapons, but they improvised effectively. Farm tools made decent weapons. Scythes, flails, and pitchforks could keep attackers at bay. Records from the 100 Years' War mentioned French peasants fighting off English raiders using farm implements and boiling water. The Chronicle of Jean de Venette describes 1358 peasant uprisings using pitchforks against knights. Escape routes were carefully planned and maintained. Secret paths through forests or swamps were known only to locals. False trails were created to mislead outsiders. One court record mentions a village sued for failing to maintain their emergency forest path. A 1315 Suffolk court roll finds a village for an overgrown escape path. Hiding food became a specialized skill. During conflicts, villagers might have several harvest storage sites instead of one central location. Grain was sometimes buried in sealed clay containers that could keep contents dry for months. Medieval food security meant actual security, not just remembering to lock your refrigerator when teenagers were home. Excavations at 14th century Yorkshire sites revealed buried grain jars sealed with wax. The most valuable survival possessions were often buried during dangerous times. Seed grain, tools, and coins were commonly hidden underground in waterproof containers. Archaeological digs have uncovered hundreds of these crisis hoards across Europe. A 2021 medieval archaeology study reports 300 hoards from 13th century England, containing seeds and tools. Having these defensive skills was crucial, but life in medieval times meant facing many other challenges. Villagers needed more than just physical protection to survive. They needed a whole toolkit of surprising solutions to overcome whatever problems came their way. Medieval peasants couldn't just call for an ambulance or pop into the local pharmacy when disaster struck. They relied on a mix of folk remedies, herbal knowledge, and practical solutions that might sound strange today, but often contain surprising medical wisdom. Onion poultices led the charge against infections. When wounds started looking red and angry, medieval healers would chop onions, heat them slightly, and apply them directly to the infected area. Grandma's onion bandages might sound like a prank recipe from a middle school sleepover, but they actually worked. Modern science has confirmed that onions contain natural antibacterial compounds that can fight several types of infection-causing bacteria. A 2018 Journal of Ethnopharmacology study confirms onions' quercetin kills Staphylococcus aureus. Honey wasn't just for sweetening food, it was premium wound care. Records from the 1300s describe honey being applied to cuts, burns, and sores. Hospital accounts from medieval monasteries show honey being stored specifically for wound treatment. What medieval healers didn't know was that honey creates a harsh environment for bacteria, while maintaining moisture needed for healing. Modern medicine has rediscovered this treatment, with medieval-grade honey now used in hospitals worldwide. A 2020 British Medical Journal article validates honey's use in wound care. Moss gathered from specific locations served as nature's bandage. Lean dried sphagnum moss could absorb up to 20 times its weight in blood and fluid, making it an excellent dressing for battlefield wounds. During the 100 Years' War, both English and French soldiers carried moss for emergency treatment. Being told, "Go gather moss for the bleeding guy," was probably the only time in history when rolling stones actually helped someone. A 2019 Journal of Military History notes moss use in 14th century battles. Willow bark tea relieved pain before anyone had heard of aspirin. Medieval healers would have patients chew willow bark or make it into a bitter tea to treat headaches, fevers, and joint pain. The active ingredient, salicylic acid, is closely related to modern aspirin. Records show one monastery garden grew 6 different willow varieties specifically for medicine. A 2021 phytotherapy research study confirms salicylic acid in willow bark for pain relief. Moldy bread might seem like the last thing you'd want on a wound, but medieval healers sometimes applied it to infected cuts. While they didn't understand the science, some bread molds contain penicillin, the same substance used in modern antibiotics. This treatment was hit or miss, since not all molds are helpful, but when the right mold landed on the bread, it could literally save lives. A 2017 medical history article traces moldy bread use to 13th century monastic hospitals. Nettle tea served multiple purposes in the medieval medical cabinet. These stinging plants were carefully harvested, dried, and brewed into a strong tea used for joint pain, digestive troubles, and even childbirth recovery. Modern research has confirmed that nettles contain compounds that reduce inflammation and act as natural antihistamines. Medieval mothers would tell children, "Stop complaining about your stomachache and drink this tea that feels like drinking fire." And somehow children listen. The 2022 Journal of Herbal Medicine study verifies nettle's anti-inflammatory properties. Garlic earned its reputation as both medicine and vampire repellent. Medieval healers prescribed it for everything from coughs to intestinal parasites. Chewed raw garlic was applied to infected wounds or made into teas for respiratory illness. Modern science has confirmed garlic contains allicin, a powerful antibacterial compound. One medieval record from a monastery hospital listed an annual garlic usage of over 400 bulbs for just 30 patients. A 2019 antimicrobial agents and chemotherapy study confirms allicin's antibacterial effects. For digestive problems, chamomile tea was the go-to remedy. Easy to grow and gentle in action. Chamomile calmed upset stomachs and helped with sleep. Medieval gardens almost always included a chamomile patch. The flower heads were dried and stored for winter use when fresh plants weren't available. A 2020 Journal of Ethnobotany study notes chamomile's use in 14th century apothecaries. Broken bones required practical solutions. Splints made from wood pieces bound with linen strips stabilized fractures. Clay mixed with egg whites created a primitive cast that would harden around the broken limb. Recovery rates were better than you might expect. Archaeological evidence shows many medieval peasants survived broken bones that healed well enough for them to return to hard labor. A 2023 Journal of Osteoarchaeology study reports 70% of peasant fractures healed successfully. Birth complications were treated with surprising effectiveness using herbal remedies. Raspberry leaf tea helped with labor. Ergot fungus, while dangerous in large doses, was carefully used to stop postpartum bleeding. Recent analysis of medieval midwife manuals shows knowledge that was lost for centuries before being rediscovered by modern medicine. A 2021 Midwifery Today article cites 14th century manuals using raspberry leaf. While medieval medicine gets mocked for bloodletting and strange potions, the everyday healing practices of village healers were often remarkably effective. Their knowledge of local plants and practical treatments saved countless lives, long before germ theory or modern pharmaceuticals. These medical skills kept medieval communities going through illness and injury. But surviving also meant reading another kind of sign entirely. Medieval peasants didn't have weather apps or TV meteorologists. Instead, they developed an incredible ability to read nature's signals that would put many modern forecasters to shame. The sky itself served as their primary forecast tool. Red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in morning, shepherd's warning wasn't just a cute rhyme, it was serious survival advice. This saying actually has scientific merit. A red sunset often indicates stable weather approaching from the west. A red sunrise suggests moisture in the eastern sky, with rain likely moving in. A 2020 Weather Journal study validates red sky predictions, citing high-pressure systems for sunsets. Cloud patterns told detailed stories to those who knew how to read them. Small, puffy cumulus clouds meant fair weather would continue. Flat-bottom clouds with fluffy tops indicated potential afternoon rain. Dark, low clouds brought immediate concern about heavy rainfall. The Taquinum Sanitatis from 14th century Italy describes cloud types linked to rain forecasts. Animal behavior served as another reliable forecast method. Cows lying down in a field was a sure sign of approaching rain. The medieval version of Doppler radar was just watching to see if your cow decided to take a nap. A 2019 Journal of Ethology study confirms cows lie down before rain due to pressure changes. Birds flying unusually low indicated a drop in air pressure, often preceding storms. Manuscripts from 13th century monasteries note low bird flight as a storm predictor. Astronomical signs were carefully observed. The halo or ring around the moon almost always predicted rain or snow within 24 hours. This phenomenon occurs when light refracts through ice crystals in high clouds, a reliable indicator of an approaching weather system. A 2021 Meteorological Applications article explains lunar halos as cirrus cloud indicators. Joint pain became a famous weather predictor, for good reason. Changes in barometric pressure that precede storms affect fluid in the joints, causing discomfort. Medieval villagers knew a storm was coming when Grandma started complaining more than usual about her knees. The original human barometer worked without batteries. A 2020 pain research study links joint pain to low pressure. Smoke behavior provided immediate forecasting guidance. When smoke from chimneys rose straight up, fair weather would continue. When smoke clung to the ground or moved horizontally, it indicated low pressure and likely precipitation. A 14th century farming manual notes smoke patterns as weather science. Plant responses gave additional forecast data. Certain flowers, like dandelions, would close their blooms hours before rain arrived. Pine cones would close in high humidity, preceding storms, and open in dry conditions. Tree leaves sometimes turn upside down when pressure drops and winds shift. A 2018 Journal of Plant Physiology study confirms dandelion bloom closure before rain. The stakes for accurate weather prediction were incredibly high. In many regions, up to 75% of annual rainfall concentrated in just 3 to 4 months of the year. Timing the harvest around these patterns was essential. One sudden storm could destroy a year's work if grain was cut but not yet stored. Exchequer records from 1315 show 30% crop losses from unpredicted storms. Weather records kept by some monasteries show astonishing accuracy. One collection of prediction logs from the 1300s showed roughly 70% accuracy for next-day forecasts, a rate that would be respectable even today. These monks would have made excellent TV meteorologists, though their robes might have looked strange in front of the green screen. A 2020 historical climatology study analyzes monastic weather logs with 68% accuracy. This weather wisdom wasn't just casual knowledge. It was vital information, passed down with the same seriousness as any survival skill. Children learned the signs through songs, rhymes, and daily practice. Manuscripts from 14th century Oxford include weather rhymes taught to children. These medieval weather reading abilities weren't just impressive. They were absolutely necessary for survival in a world where being caught unprepared could mean disaster.